welcome back to the Cyclonic Thrift Channel, your home for competitive magic on a budget. As always, please hit that like button and subscribe, and without further ado, let's get thrifty. And the commander we'll be talking about today is Saruman, the White Hand. He's a new commander out of the Lord of the Rings set that came out a couple months ago. He's 1 blue, black, red for a legendary creature, Avatar Wizard. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, amass Orcs X, where X is that spell's mana value, and then goblins and orcs you control have Ward 2. So, with this commander, with the 2 lines of text, there's really 2 ways that you could go about it. One, you could do a goblin orc tribal, where you give basically all of your creatures Ward 2, super hard board state to interact with, go wide, go tall if you want. It'd be a super interesting build, but not something that we're going to focus on in this deck tech. I really want to focus on the casting on creature spells and amassing Orcs X. So for those of you who don't know, when you amass Orcs X, that's denoting the mechanic where you create, where you put X +1/+1 counters on a token Orc army you control, which is really just a 0/0 token. It's mostly used with token zombies in past sets, but they just changed the name to orcs for this set for the Lord of the Rings flavor. So essentially, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you're going to add X +1/+1 counters to an orc army that you control. However, if you don't control an orc army when you cast the spell, you create one first. So essentially you create the 0/0 token and then put on the X +1/+1 counters. But if you already control an orc army, then you're just going to add the counters to that already existing army. So it's a way to, if you keep that orc around for 1, 2, 3 turns, to pump him up to the moon. You could have a 10/10 orc at some point. However, what I want to do with this deck is actually use that token generation to our advantage by using a lot of small non-creature spells that sacrifice creatures as an additional cost. So essentially what we'll do is we'll cast a non-creature spell, sack a creature, and then amass Orcs X, creating that 1/1, 2/2 orc. And then the next spell that we cast, we're going to sacrifice that orc and create a new one. So you'll see what I mean when we get to that section of the deck tech. But essentially we're going to turn that, as well as a lot of non-creature spell value, into massive damage that's going to really help to beat down the rest of the board. We're going to try to go wide as much as possible, but really we're going to look to, if we can, win through Storm, essentially casting a ton of spells in our turn, creating mana through the casting of those spells, creating creatures, creating damage, and essentially trying to go off out of nowhere and win the game. So, with that, let's get into some of the cards we want to talk about. The first section is essentially redundant effects with our commander. And not redundant, I don't mean that, but effects that, where Saruman says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get something. We want to have as many of those effects as possible. So the first example of that that I want to talk about is Firebrand Archer. 1 in a red for a creature, Human Archer 2/1. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent. So super simple, super easy. As we're casting these small, low-to-the-ground spells, these instant sorceries, even artifacts, they're just going to turn into damage that, 1 damage at a time doesn't seem like a lot, but it is going to build up over the course of the game. And, if you have this card out towards the end of the game, you could turn it into a win con just by casting enough spells. The second card I want to talk about is Saheeli, Sublime Artificer. She's 1 and then 2 Izzets, so either you can pay a blue or a red for either one. And actually this is a Planeswalker, which comes in with 5 loyalty, And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. So again, super simple. We're really bringing her in just for that ability. She does have the -2 of target artifact you control becomes a copy of another target artifact or creature you control till the end of turn. But that we're not running a very artifact-heavy deck here. We're really looking to have her out for that creature production. Because essentially what this does is exactly what our commander does, where whenever we're casting on creature spells, we create a 1/1, and we can use that 1/1 to sacrifice in response to the subsequent spells that we're casting. So if we happen to have Saruman removed, but we have Saheeli on the battlefield, we can, in a way, continue that train. And then finally, we have Ovika Enigma Goliath. 5 blue and a red for legendary creature Phyrexian Nightmare, 6/6. It's got flying and then ward, pay 3 and pay 3 life. So it's going to be super hard to target for your opponents. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create X 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens, where X is the mana value of that spell, and they gain haste till end of turn. So this is, this is a late game, massive blowout play, where you get her down, and maybe, you don't necessarily, 7 mana, it's a lot to do in one turn and then continue to do things, especially for a Spellslinger deck. But if you get her down and then get back to your next turn, you're going to churn out a ton of goblins here. And because they all have haste, there's a good chance that you'll be able to overrun the board and finish, players off. If your Firebrand Archer has gotten them down low enough, you can just swing in with enough goblins to take them out. This is a win con in and of itself, and especially if we start casting some of our larger non-creature spells, we're gonna flood the board with this card for sure. Now, we've talked a lot about token production, creature production, things that are going to come into the battlefield when we cast these non-creature spells. So I want to talk a little bit more about how we're going to turn that into damage or loss of life, because there is one major fun way that I want to win this with this deck that I'll talk about later. But I think the more consistent way is to get some of these next few pieces out, along with our commander, along with Saheeli, along with Ovika, churn out a bunch of creatures and turn that into damage that's going to devastate the battlefield. So the first one in that group is Witty Roastmaster. He's 2 and a red for a creature Devil Citizen, 3/2. And he has Alliance. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Witty Roastmaster deals 1 damage to each opponent. So super simple. With Saruman on the battlefield, it's essentially another type of Firebrand Archer, where you cast a creature, or you cast a non-creature spell, create that orc token, deal 1 damage to each opponent. Now with Ovika, it's even better, because say you cast a non-creature spell that has mana value 4, you're going to create 4 tokens and deal 4 damage to each opponent. So it ramps up with, as you create more creatures, you deal more damage. However, the next card in here I actually like a little bit more. It's also from the Lord of the Rings set. It's called Mirkwood Bats. It's 3 and a black for a creature bat, 2/3. It has flying, and whenever you create or sacrifice a token, each opponent loses 1 life. So essentially exactly the same thing with Saruman, Saheeli, Ovika. Whenever you're creating that creature token, each opponent's going to lose a life. However, it has the added ability of sacrificing those tokens, each opponent losing 1 life. So, as you'll see later, a lot of these low-to-the-ground spells that we have the additional casting cost of sacrificing a creature, and we're going to try to choose the orcs that Saruman makes, or the servos that Saheeli makes. And that's just going to essentially double up the life loss for our opponents for each of those creatures. So this is going to be a really powerful card in this deck, and like I said, it's just going to ramp up the speed at which we drain our opponents for life using this strategy. And then we also have Torwaki the Younger. He's 3 black and a red for a legendary creature Human Archer, 3/3. He's got Reach and Lifelink. And if another source you control would deal non-combat damage to a permanent or player, it deals that much damage +1 to that permanent or player instead. So specifically it says dealing damage. So Mirkwood Bats does not count in this sense because its opponent's losing life. But Witty Roastmaster it certainly does. So it essentially doubles up the damage that Witty Roastmaster does to each opponent. Firebrand Archer, like we mentioned before, that's dealing damage, so it's going to double up that effect. But then also Torwaki has, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Torwaki the Younger deals 2 damage to any target. And we have a ton of instants and sorceries in this deck, a la non-creature spells. And so whenever we cast one of those, he's going to deal 2 damage. His own ability is going to add another damage to that instead, so he's essentially dealing 3 damage on top of it. So we're just going to be turning all of our small little spells into 3 damage, right? And now it's to any target, not each opponent, which, you know, we can kind of spread around more strategically this way. But the lifelink is also a sneaky important aspect here, because we're going to be able to gain life as we're doing this, and kind of keep ourselves as far away from 0 as possible. But now let's move into some of those spells that I was talking about where we're sacrificing creatures, right? And you can kind of see the strategy that I'm trying to think of right now. So the first one is Collateral Damage. It's 1 red for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. And Collateral Damage deals 3 damage to any target. So the effect of this card, 3 damage to any target, you know, it's so-so, right? It's a lightning bolt, essentially, that you have to sacrifice a creature for. But again, you have to think of it through the lens of if we have all of the previous pieces we've talked about on the battlefield. Not all of them, obviously, but a few of them, right? With Saruman, you know, we sacrifice that orc and we create another orc. With Firebrand Archer, we're dealing a damage to any target. With Torwaki, we're dealing 3 damage with Torwaki, and then this I'm trying to think of right now. So the first one is Collateral Damage. It's 1 red for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. And Collateral Damage deals 3 damage to any target. So the effect of this card, 3 damage to any target, you know, it's so-so, right? It's a lightning bolt, essentially, that you have to sacrifice a creature for. But again, you have to think of it through the lens of if we have all of the previous pieces we've talked about on the battlefield. Not all of them, obviously, but a few of them, right? With Saruman, you know, we sacrifice that orc and we create another orc. With Firebrand Archer, we're dealing a damage to any target. With Torwaki, we're dealing 3 damage with Torwaki, and then this will deal an additional damage as well. So it works much better in concert with the rest of the combo pieces we'll have on the battlefield. The next one is Bone Shards. It's a black for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature or discard a card, and destroy target creature or planeswalker. So, as removal goes, super cheap. Super cheap. And, you know, they try to offset it by adding that sacrificing a creature aspect to it. But because our plan is to sacrifice the creatures anyway, and we're just going to get additional creatures and, you know, as a result of casting this card, it's essentially a 0 effect on us. So we're going to be able to destroy creatures, planeswalkers for 1 mana, which is an insane rate, as well as dealing damage with Firebrand Archer, creating tokens with Saruman or Saheeli. It's going to be the perfect card to put into this type of deck. And then the third one here just adds a little bit of card draw. It's called Village Rites. It's a black for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. So again, you know, 1 mana to draw 2 cards is excellent. The sacrificing the creature kind of gets nullified because we're going to be creating creatures, and in addition to the damage and other effects that we're going to have with our other pieces. So that's a taste of a lot of low-to-the-ground instants and sorceries we have in this deck. Check out the full deck tech with the link in the description to see just how many that we've got in here. But that's really going to be our main path to victory, is to get a few of those permanent pieces that we talked about before in the battlefield, and then cast a ton of these low to the ground instants and sorceries and turn that into insane damage. Alright, so with that we can move into the veggies portion of that into insane damage. Alright, so with that we can move into the veggies portion of the deck tech. Like I said, anytime you do a budget deck, you have to make sure you eat your veggies, or else you're not really going to be able to compete consistently with some of the higher powered, higher budget decks at the table. So when I talk about veggies, I essentially mean mana ramp, card draw, and target removal. So I'm just going to go through each of those categories real quick, give you some examples of cards that we're putting in the deck that fit those descriptions. So the first one in ramp is Goblin Electromancer. It's blue and a red for creature Goblin Wizard, 2/2. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Super easy include. It's going to reduce a ton of mana over the course of the game. It's going to be a big piece for us. The second is Stormkiln Artist, 3 and a red for a creature Dwarf Shaman. It's a 2/2. Stormkiln Artist gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control, and whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a treasure token. So the first part of that, him getting buffed for each artifact we have, isn't super relevant because this isn't an artifact heavy deck. But the second part, where we're casting instant sorceries and creating treasures, is super relevant. Like I said, a lot of our instants and sorceries are 1 mana, either a black or a red or a blue, and so we want to be able to, as I said at the beginning, cast as many as we can in a certain turn, right? And the two biggest challenges of that is, 1, having enough of those cards in our hand and drawing enough of those cards, and 2, having the mana production to continue casting those cards. With card draw, we have a lot of those instants and sorceries that will draw cards on their own and just have that as kind of an incidental aspect of the card. So the card draw we've taken care of a lot better, but for the mana ramp, especially on a budget, Stormkiln Artist is going to be the most consistent, most powerful card that has that effect in this deck, because we cast a sorcery for 1 mana, right? We get all the effects that casting non-creature spells has, and we create a treasure token. We then use that treasure token to cast the next 1 mana spell, right? And then go back and forth, back and forth. As long as we're drawing cards and casting 1 mana spells, we'll be able to go through essentially as many as we can until we run out of luck. and we get so, but potentially we could cast 10, 12, 15 spells as long as we keep both trains going. So Stormkiln Artist is going to be a huge player in this deck. And the last one is Infernal Plunge. It's 1 red for sorcery. Fits that bill that we were talking about earlier. As an additional cost to cast Infernal Plunge, sacrifice a creature. Already talked about that in that strategy. And then you add 3 red to your mana pool. So again, this is kind of a lesser mana production card, but we can certainly use those 3 mana to continue casting spells, and it'll help extend our turn as much as we can. Moving forward into the card draw section, again, the second half of our Stormkiln Artist non-creature spell win con, we've got quite a few. So the first is Treasure Cruise. It's 7 and a blue for a sorcery. It has Delve. So essentially what that means is, as you cast this spell, you can exile cards from your graveyard, and each card you exile pays for one of the generic mana, and then you draw 3 cards. So in this deck, we're going to have a ton of spells. So in this deck, we're going to have a ton of spells in our graveyard, because we're going to be casting them at, each and every turn. So we'll have no problem delving and exiling cards from our graveyard. So in this deck, we're going to have a ton of spells in our graveyard, because we're going to be casting them at, each and every turn. So we'll have no problem delving and exiling cards from our graveyard, so most likely we'll be able to cast this for just a blue and draw 3 cards, keeping our machine moving down the road. The second one is Smothering Abomination. It's 2 and a black for a creature Eldrazi, 4/3. It has Devoid, card has no color, that's not relevant. It has Flying, and at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature, and whenever you sacrifice a creature, draw a card. Now this is going to be the second piece, right? If we have this out and Stormkiln Artist out, then, well, I guess in addition to Saruman or Saheeli or any of the other token generators that we have in the deck, then we're going to be able to cast spells, sacrifice creatures, draw cards, and create mana, repeat. So this is the second, I'd say, most powerful card in the deck, because it's going to help, again, fuel our win-con machine moving forward. And then the third card is Vivisection. It's 3 and a blue for a sorcery. As additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice a creature. Already talked about that. And draw 3 cards. So, yeah. So that all fits into the card draw aspect of it. And like I said, we have a ton of those 1-mana instants and sorceries that, as an additional, benefit of the card, it just says draw a card. It just replaces itself, which is going to be super helpful in this deck. And then finally with removal, we talked a little bit about it earlier with Bone Shards, the 1-mana type of spells that will destroy creatures, planeswalkers. The next one is Annihilating Glare for a black. It's a sorcery. As additional cost to cast this spell, you pay 4 or sacrifice an artifact or creature. Right, fits right into the theme. And then destroy target creature or planeswalker. Super simple, super easy. And then the next one I wanted to talk about briefly is another Lord of the Rings card. It's Gandalf's Sanction. It's 1, a blue and a red for a sorcery. Gandalf's Sanction deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. Excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. So, like I said, we're going to have a ton of those instant and sorcery cards just by playing our game plan. And so this is going to deal a ton of damage when we get it off. Essentially, if we're at the end of the game, we just need to finish off a player, this can be a super helpful card to take out an opponent. And that brings us to our thrift pick. And that brings us to the thrift pick of this deck tech. And it probably won't surprise anybody, I talked it up in a major way when we got to it, but Stormkiln Artist is just such a unique card, especially in a budget deck. There are not very many cards that have this type of effect where you're able to generate mana for free every time you cast an instant or sorcery spell. There's lots of cards in this deck that will draw you cards, and that will kind of run the engine from the other side, but Stormkiln Artist is going to be the most effective, most powerful mana production engine that will fuel kind of the storming off win con that we're trying to get to. And that brings us to the end. Hope you guys... Alright, and that brings us to the end of this deck tech. I hope you guys enjoyed, took some inspiration for yourselves. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. And yeah, check out the full deck list with the link in the description. Thank you guys. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video and were able to take some inspiration for your own thrifty decks. Comment down below if you think of any cards I missed or could have replaced. This is an educational channel, so additional insight and information is always welcome. In addition, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I appreciate you all for sticking around, and until next time, stay thrifty.